You're nothing but a rotten piece of the past, Marjorie. And this house, sooner or later, it will be mine, not yours. That was the line Ariana Brooks, my vicious daughter-in-law, threw at my face like a blade. But in the very moment she thought she owned the whole game, everything flipped within seconds. Because at the bottom of her own closet, I found the secret phone containing every message about her staged accident, along with the recording of Ariana bragging to her friend, "I'll kick that old woman onto the street without a penny." In that instant, Ariana's real face appeared. Not a victim, not a sweet daughter-in-law, but a predator, someone determined to steal my house, take my son, and tear my life apart. If you were me, would you stay silent while someone tries to steal your home? Would you swallow humiliation just to keep a fake peace? Or would you stand up before your life is destroyed? If you want to see how I locked Ariana outside my door at 3 a.m., hit follow now and comment "Continue" to unlock the next part of the story. I am Marjorie Hale, a dark-skinned woman in my early 50s, living in the house that has grown old but still holds the warmth of Victor. After losing him, all I had left were 4 walls and memories. Every scratch on the banister, every patch of peeling paint on the front door reminded me that this was where the two of us spent our entire lives. I tried to keep everything intact, as if that could hold on to his hands a little longer. So when Evan called saying he wanted to bring his new wife to stay here for a while, I agreed because I loved my son, but an unfamiliar tightness gripped my heart. A faint, dark intuition told me I was about to lose something else I might not be strong enough to protect. The door opened and Ariana walked in. I had never met her before, but one glance was enough to tell me something was wrong. Her eyes drifted over every object in the house, like someone appraising a newly acquired property. Not the gaze of a person coming home, but the gaze of someone inspecting a prize. The living room was soaked in sunlight, yet her presence made the space turn cold. Ariana turned to Evan, curled her lips into a smile I couldn't tell was friendly or challenging, then looked straight at me and dropped a line that cracked through the air. This house, old and low energy, just like its owner. Evan laughed, thinking it was a joke, but I didn't. Her words landed squarely in my chest, sharp as a blade. I'd lived here all my life, shaping every brick, every object, every memory with Victor, and she dismissed all of that the moment she walked through the door. I forced a thin smile so Evan wouldn't feel awkward, but inside a chill began to spread. Ariana moved slowly through the living room, her fingertips drifting across the table, the photo frames, the bookshelf. Every motion carried the sense of someone marking territory. Evan watched her with proud, adoring eyes, as if she were a gift life handed him. But all I felt was a rising unease. The way Ariana walked, the way she flicked her hair, the way her lips curved whenever she glanced around, it all carried an energy that made my skin prickle. When she passed the wall where Victor's will hung, Ariana paused longer than anywhere else. Her eyes narrowed as if she were reading every line. Then she glanced sideways at me, her expression unreadable. She lowered her head just slightly, her voice soft but clear enough for me to hear. "One day, this house will carry a different last name, you'll see." A casual sentence, but heavy like a blow to the heart. I didn't respond. I stood there with my hand on the back of a chair as if to steady myself. I sensed immediately that this was not a matter of simply not getting along. It was the feeling of standing before someone who knew exactly what she wanted and had no fear of how she would take it. Evan pulled Ariana closer to me, introducing her with excitement in his voice. I tried to smile to keep the peace, but there was not a hint of warmth or respect in her eyes. She looked at me as though I were the last obstacle between her and whatever she aimed to own. When I led them into the kitchen, Evan talked about their relationship, all the good things Ariana brought into his life. I listened while swallowing a lump in my throat. Ariana nodded while scanning the kitchen, her lips curling as a line of sunlight touched my face. It was a half smile, precise enough to unsettle someone, a smile without kindness. When Evan turned away to get water, I caught Ariana's eyes. In them, there was no softness, no affection, no sense of family, only calculation. As if she already knew I was a problem to remove, an equation to solve. The unease inside me wasn't vague anymore. It was sharp as a needle under my skin. I'd lived long enough to know that some people need only seconds to reveal the storm they carry. Ariana was exactly that. The way she stood in my home, the way she examined every detail, the way she squeezed Evan's hand every time she said something that unsettled me, everything suggested that the quiet life I'd built was under threat. When I led them upstairs, Ariana followed behind, her hand brushing the wooden banister Victor had once polished with such care. Watching her touch it made my chest tighten. Every object in this house was tied to a memory of him, but the way Ariana touched things felt like she was deciding what to discard first. Standing at the top of the stairs, she looked down at the whole house with an expression filled with possession. When Evan wrapped an arm around her waist, Ariana tilted her head and looked at me. A faint smile lifted one corner of her mouth sharp enough to cut. She said in a calm, icy voice, "From now on, nothing will be the way you want it." I stood still for a few seconds, feeling someone's hand closing around my heart. I didn't know exactly what Ariana intended to do, but I sensed with painful clarity that the peace I'd protected for years had just been touched by a foreign hand. And from that moment on, I couldn't be sure how long I could hold on to it. I turned away, first hiding the heaviness climbing through my chest, but deep down, I knew the storm had walked into my home, and whatever was coming would not be easy. Everything began with that thin smile and that ominous sentence echoing in my mind like a warning I could not ignore. I once thought I understood what chaos looked like, but life always finds new ways to hurt a person. From the moment Ariana stepped inside the house, I preserved through Victor's memories began to change with every breath. The laughter, the scraping of chairs, the clinking of glasses echoing down the stairs. Each late night made the old walls seem to quiver like I did. Some nights I sat in the dark listening to cars stop in front of the house, knowing another group of guests Ariana had invited was arriving, even though Evan had tried to tell her I needed quiet. But Ariana always found a way to bend every reminder as if it meant nothing. Her gatherings stretched until 3 in the morning. Light spilled from the living room onto the ceiling, music pounding hard enough to tear at the layers of paint. I opened my bedroom door, stepped out onto the upstairs railing, and looked down. They danced, laughed loudly, left their shoes in the hallway, spilled bottles and glasses onto the carpet I still washed by hand every month. Ariana stood in the center, head tilted back slightly, hair falling over her shoulders, holding up a glass of wine as she urged her friends on like the rightful owner of the house. When I walked down the stairs, the smell of alcohol mixed with smoke tightened my breath. I spoke softly so Evan wouldn't feel awkward, but clearly enough for Ariana to hear. "Ariana, it's late. Everyone should go." She turned her lips curving with careless defiance, then released a line I never forgot. "My house. I'll play the music however loud I want." Her voice was firm without a hint of restraint. Evan heard it. hesitated with discomfort, but he only pulled me aside to avoid worsening the tension. I looked at my son's face and saw confusion and fatigue, but also the softness Ariana held tightly in her hands. The music rose again, louder than before, as if answering directly to my presence. I returned to my room, leaning against the door, heart pounding. Victor's shadow appeared in my mind, the way he always cared for this home, like it was his treasure. If he were alive, he would never bear this. Just thinking that made my throat tighten. The next day, I straightened up the living room, gathered each glass, each scrap of tissue thrown across the tables. Sunlight touched Victor's framed photo while I tried to stay composed, wiping it clean. When I bent down to pick up the small lamp Victor had carved from a piece of wood he'd found on our last trip together, Ariana walked by. She didn't look at me, only at the lamp. Then she suddenly kicked it hard. The lamp shattered into small pieces, hitting the floor with sharp clicks as if falling into my chest. I froze, my hands shaking. Ariana crouched down to look at what remained, gave a faint, cold laugh, and said, as if commenting on something filthy, "Why would you keep trash from a dead person? Gross." That sentence wasn't a blow. It was a slow cut, dragging across every memory I held close. My entire body stiffened. I knelt to pick up the wooden pieces, fumbling with the broken edges that could never be restored. Ariana walked away as if she hadn't just broken the most precious thing I owned. That evening, Evan came home late. I stood near the sink, my fingers still stained with wood dust. Evan glanced at the broken pieces on the table, then asked lazily, "Mom being difficult again? If something's old, just throw it out." I turned to look at my son into the eyes I once held since he was a newborn. I wanted to tell him Victor made it with his own hands, that it was worth more than anything Ariana brought into this house, but the words choked before they could escape. Evan didn't wait for me to explain. He just clicked his tongue and said the sentence that made my chest fall apart. "You're just like a lonely old woman, way too difficult." I stood still, feeling a cold stream crawling down my spine. Evan didn't mean to hurt me, but that sentence crushed me. Ariana had planted something in him to make him speak that way. I turned away, hiding the wound sinking into my chest. That night, I opened my door to collect the towels I had left in the hallway. When I approached the stairs, I stopped because I heard Ariana's voice. She was on the phone, speaking quietly but sharply, each word slipping through the air straight into my ears. Getting rid of her is as easy as snapping my fingers. I froze for a heartbeat, my heart clenching. And I understood everything I had just gone through was only the beginning. I once thought the worst Ariana could do was turn my home into a battlefield of noise, but she had an even more vicious plan prepared. When my belongings were destroyed, I felt physical pain, and when Victor's memories were trampled, my heart hurt. But here, Ariana attacked my mind, tearing apart my dignity in the dirtiest way. She began shaping a distorted version of me, scattering it across the house and the neighborhood, making everyone believe I was an unstable, dangerous mother-in-law. That afternoon, I was arranging things in the kitchen when I heard the long, dragging sound of sobbing. The sound was slow and caught in the throat, as if the person crying had a deep ache in their chest. I thought maybe Evan and Ariana had argued, so I stepped out to check. But when I reached the last stair, I saw Ariana sitting on the sofa, burying her face into Evan's shoulder. Her tears soaked through his shirt. Evan stroked her back, his expression full of worry, as if he were protecting a helpless child. I stood still for exactly 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds were enough for Ariana to lift her head, eyelashes wet with tears, and look at me with trembling, fragile eyes. Her voice broke, but every word was clear. I'm scared of your mother. She looks at me like she wants to kill me." Evan snapped his head toward me, his eyes filled with confusion and resistance. He didn't say it out loud, but that look demanded to know how I could treat his wife that way. It felt as though someone had just taken all the air out of my lungs. I had never done anything to Ariana except gently remind her of a few things, except try to keep peace. Yet she painted me as a monster right in front of my son. That night, I heard whispering in the kitchen. When I stepped out, I saw Ariana on the phone. She spoke quickly, sounding concerned for me, but every sentence felt like a blade stabbing my reputation. "Your mother keeps talking to the walls, really worrying." Then she noticed me standing behind her. She didn't flinch or stumble over her words. She simply gazed at me with fake sympathy, as if she were trying to hide a secret illness of mine. The next morning, I went outside to water the plants. Mrs. Carter, my next-door neighbor, walked over. Her eyes softened with pity. "Marjorie, your daughter-in-law said you haven't been well lately. Are you depressed?" The water in my hands trembled, dripping onto the soil in uneven drops. I tried to stay composed, but the word depressed felt like a stone landing on my chest. Ariana didn't just want to push me out. She wanted people to believe I wasn't mentally stable enough to stay in my own home. I went back inside, my heart cooling piece by piece. That morning, I poured tea, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I heard Ariana telling Evan something in the living room, her tone lowered, as if she didn't want me to hear, but loud enough for each word to reach me. "I don't want your mom to get hurt, but I'm so scared. I just hope she stops attacking me." I stood in the kitchen, watching steam rise from the kettle, feeling the pain climb up my throat. Evan walked in, looking at me with a mixture of unease and guardedness. He asked if I was angry at Ariana, sounding like a man trying to balance both sides. I looked at my son, then at the cup of tea in my hand, bitterness swelling inside me. I said the one sentence I had been holding back for days. "If you're suffering that much, move out of my house." I didn't raise my voice or blame anyone. I said it because I was exhausted, because I was hurting. But Ariana stood right behind Evan, her lips lifting slightly, her eyes sharp like a pointed blade. She stepped forward, stared straight at me, and replied with a voice firm as steel. "No. You're the one who has to go." The room seemed to sink. Evan looked between us, his face stretched by shock and confusion. I wanted to step toward him and say this was my house, that no one had the right to kick me out of the place Victor and I built. But the words caught in my throat, and I stood frozen, feeling my whole body tied down by pain. Ariana looked at Evan with watery eyes, placing a hand on her chest, as if she were holding unbearable heartbreak. Then she turned toward me, letting the performance slip, revealing a completely different gaze, a gaze cold, deep, sharp, like a tightening rope. She lowered her head, slightly moved closer, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "You'll fall into my trap soon." I stood still, goosebumps crawling across my skin. I didn't know what that trap was, but I could feel it had been closing around me for far longer than I realized. That night, the air inside the house grew so heavy, I felt as if each step touched a bottomless darkness. Evan had just gone to bed after hours of tension caused by Ariana's lies. I sat in the living room, both hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, trying to find a moment of calm among the fragments of emotion rising inside me. But that calm didn't last long. Evan's phone rang in his room. I thought it was just a late call from a coworker, but the sound he made from upstairs crushed my chest like a blow. It didn't sound like anything I had ever heard from him, trembling, broken, like a world collapsing. I ran up, reached his door, and saw Evan kneeling on the floor, his phone fallen from his hand, his eyes swollen red. I rushed forward, grabbing his shoulders. "Evan, what happened, son?" He choked, his breath catching. "The police, they said a dark-skinned woman died in an accident. They said she looks like Ariana." The sentence dropped like a stone into a quiet lake. My vision blurred, my mind spun, as if someone had turned off all the other sounds and left only a storm inside my chest. I held Evan tightly while panic clawed at me. What if I hurt her too much?" I whispered without realizing the words had slipped out. We hurried to the scene at the address given by the police. The night stretched endlessly, the flashing lights of police cars cutting through the dark like an open wound. I stood behind Evan, clutching the sleeve of his jacket, feeling like I could collapse at any moment. A white sheet lay on the pavement, long dark hair spilling out from underneath, and Evan screamed in despair. "Mom! God! Mom!" Ariana. He sank to his knees, burying his face in his trembling hands. I stood frozen, my ears ringing, until only the sound of his broken breathing remained. I wanted to reach him, to pull him up, to say we needed to wait for confirmation, but my legs felt cemented to the ground, my heart tightening with each passing second. When a police officer approached, I barely had the strength to process anything. He said they were still identifying the victim, that the face was severely injured, and that they needed more time. Evan covered his face and sobbed, his shoulders shaking like a child abandoned in the middle of a storm. I longed to hold him and tell him nothing was certain yet, but even I felt the thread of hope thinning inside me. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. Evan barely ate, barely drank, sitting in his room, slipping in and out of panic. I drowned in guilt. I walked through the house Ariana once trampled, where she shattered Victor's belongings and used tears to manipulate Evan. Yet in those 2 days, I blamed myself for not being gentler, for not keeping her safe beside my son. I even stepped into Evan's room, placed my hand on his shoulder, and said, "I'm sorry for everything. If I hurt her, I'm sorry." He didn't answer, but the despair in his eyes made me feel like a cruel woman, like a mother who had pushed her daughter-in-law toward a tragic end. During those 2 days, whenever I looked at the sofa where Ariana used to sit, a sharp pain rose in my chest. I remembered her venomous words toward me, but in the midst of this nightmare, all that venom dissolved into a heavier guilt. On the morning of the second day, the police called to say the victim wasn't Ariana. Evan nearly collapsed again, but this time from relief. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a fragile light, finally returning after a torturous nightmare. I hugged him, feeling as if someone had pulled me up from a cliff, but the relief lasted only minutes. When we returned home, I saw my phone light up. A message from Ariana's number. "Don't trust her. Ariana." I stood in the hallway, my hand trembling. Ariana was alive, and with that message, I understood she was starting a game far darker than anything she had done before. A cold shiver ran down my spine, like the shadows in my house were spreading. If Ariana could stage an accident that nearly destroyed Evan, then she was preparing something even more vicious. And before I could catch my breath, I realized this was only the opening act of a far worse nightmare. 2 days of living in the shadow of a death report made me think I had already seen the bottom of fear, but I was wrong. Real fear doesn't come from death. It comes from the moment someone you believed was gone walks back in with an intact face and a spirit darker and sharper than before. That afternoon, while I stood at the sink watching droplets fall, as if counting each beat of my heart, the front door burst open so abruptly my aunt jolted. and Ariana walked in long strides straight back like a diva stepping off a red carpet. She tossed her hair, set her bag on the table, lifted her chin, and looked at me with a smile cold enough to raise every hair on my arms. Thought I was really dead, didn't you? Pathetic. The words slid out as lightly as breath, yet pierced my skin like a poisoned pin. I froze for a few seconds, not out of fear, but because too many emotions surged at once. For 2 days, I lived inside the echo of that police call, inside Evan's sobs, inside a suffocating guilt that I might have driven Ariana toward her tragic end. And now Ariana stood there as if she had gone on a short vacation and returned with perfect hair and a razor-edged smile. I looked into her eyes and saw a soul that feared nothing, regretted nothing, and understood no boundaries. Evan heard the door and rushed down as if pulled by a string. When he saw Ariana, he stopped, then wrapped his arms around her like someone being handed back the air he breathed. Ariana pressed her cheek to his shoulder, but her eyes stayed fixed on mine. The corners lifted into a mocking smirk. She placed a hand on Evan's chest, her tone soft as silk but dripping poison. I disappeared, and your mother wasn't even sad. I'm disgusted. Evan turned toward me, his gaze like needles sinking straight into my heart. That look carried blame, confusion, and doubt. I saw something crack inside him, something Ariana had already planted deep enough that he couldn't tell what was real anymore. I parted my lips, wanting to tell him that for 2 days I had held him in his grief, that I thought I'd pushed Ariana to her death, that I had apologized to him because I felt guilty, but my lips trembled too hard to form words. Ariana stepped out of Evan's embrace and walked into the kitchen as if she owned it. She opened the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter, crossing her legs with effortless confidence. "You're old. You can't manage this house anymore," she said, her tone steady, her eyes watching every shift in my expression. Evan stood behind her without speaking, without defending me, staring at the floor as if he wanted to be on both sides but was being dragged toward hers. I stared at the two of them, at the home Victor and I built brick by brick, the place where Evan grew up, the place I protected through every grief. And now Ariana stood in it like a queen, assessing her territory. She looked around as if evaluating everything she believed would soon belong to her. I recognized that gaze from the first day she stepped inside this house. Now it was sharper, heavier, charged with authority, as if she had undergone a rebirth of malice. As I tried to steady myself, Ariana placed the bottle down and walked closer to the kitchen table. "You know," she said with that artificially sweet voice, "this house should be managed by someone young, someone with plans, someone who understands the value of the future." She placed her hand on Evan's shoulder, squeezed lightly, then continued in a lower tone, her breath drifting like heat across my skin. "Evan and I can handle that." Evan glanced at me, waiting for my reaction. I looked deeply into his eyes, searching for the little boy he once was. But all I saw was a man caught in a maze Ariana built. I breathed in slowly, forcing my chest not to break. Ariana circled the table, opened a drawer, rummaged through it. Evan watched her like her actions were entirely normal. When she turned back, she held a stack of freshly printed papers, the edges still warm from the printer. She set them on the table, turning them toward me, and pushed them forward with her fingertip, calm and chilling. I looked down. My eyes hit the first line, property transfer documents. For a moment, the world stopped. I realized Ariana was no longer probing or testing. She had entered the final phase of her plan. Every sentence she had ever said, every half smile, every blade-like glance snapped together into one clear picture. She wanted this house. She wanted me gone from Evan's life. She wanted to erase every trace of Victor. Evan still stood there silent, passive, his gaze torn between us, but not strong enough to side with me. The room shrank around me, like the walls were closing in, trying to crush what was left of my strength. I placed my fingertips on the corner of the papers, the coldness of the sheet jolting my chest. Ariana tilted her head, her lips lifting in a victorious curve. In that moment, one realization slid through me, cold and absolute. Ariana hadn't just returned. She returned to finish me. After Ariana laid the stack of house transfer papers on the kitchen table as casually as dropping a blade into the room, I thought I had reached the limit of what I could endure. But she had another layer of venom, a deeper trap, that made me feel like I was living in a house that no longer belonged to me. Every step, every object, every small sound became a warning that Ariana wanted to crush whatever clarity I still had. From the moment she returned after the accident, there was a heaviness pressing down on my chest, as if the house itself had begun leaning toward her. The first morning after her return, I opened the cabinet to take my blood pressure medication, as I did every day. But the bottle wasn't where it should be. I checked every drawer, every box, every corner, my hands shaking as minutes passed, and the thing I needed still hadn't appeared. I remembered clearly placing it in the silver case next to my handkerchief. The house was so quiet that my breathing echoed like the frantic beat of something trapped. I looked again, trying to force calm into my hands. Ariana walked past the kitchen at that exact moment, her hair still damp as if she had just washed it, her perfume thickening the air. She stared at me for a few seconds before asking lightly, "What are you looking for?" "I'm looking for my medicine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I put it here, and now it's gone." Ariana tilted her head, her lips lifting into a thin smile. "If you misplaced your medicine, how would I know? You should get your brain checked." The sentence dropped a cold fog over my spine. She didn't raise her voice, didn't mock me openly, but released the words as if stating a fact. As she walked out, I remained still, my hand resting on the cabinet door, searching for balance so I wouldn't feel myself swaying. Over the next 2 days, the things I used daily began switching places. A spoon ended up in the knife drawer, the kitchen towel vanished, then reappeared in the living room. My shoes by the door were moved to the dark corner under the stairs. I felt like I was in a house I could no longer recognize, as if every familiar corner had been rearranged without my knowledge. I looked around and felt the walls breathing, watching the disorder tighten around my mind. One afternoon, while I watered the plants on the porch, Mrs. Carter walked over. She looked at me with the expression Ariana had cultivated so well, a blend of pity, caution, and fear. "Marjorie, your daughter-in-law told me you've been confused lately, forgetting things, losing track. Are you all right?" I stood still, the hose dripping water onto the ground in long, uneven streaks. I wanted to explain, but my throat felt gritty. I only nodded faintly, then went back inside, each step heavy, like the sky itself was pressing down on me. Inside the living room, Evan was on the sofa, staring at me with the impatience Ariana had planted in him. "Mom Ariana said you've been mixing up things these past days. Are you feeling okay?" I looked at my son, countless memories flickering behind his eyes. But buried inside was doubt, sharp enough to cut. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't confused, that someone else was moving the objects. But before I could speak, Ariana stepped out of the kitchen and set a glass of water in front of Evan. She didn't look at me, but her voice slid into my ears like a scratch. "I'm just worried about her. She keeps saying she put things in the right place, but we find them everywhere." I stepped back, feeling like staying close any longer would suffocate me. I went upstairs, shut the door, and let the darkness swallow my breath. That night, I didn't sleep. I thought about the missing items, the pitying looks, the whispers Ariana planted. Each thing felt like a tiny needle driven into me, meant to make me unravel. The next morning, I called Daniel Ross, the attorney, who had worked with my family for more than 20 years. I met him at his office, where the light fell across rows of file cabinets, making everything seem clearer. Daniel listened carefully as I recounted every detail I had kept buried for weeks. When I finished, Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "You're being set up. This is a deliberate psychological manipulation. You need to gather evidence immediately." A cold wave rose from my stomach and spread into my chest. Daniel continued, "Stay calm. Don't let any reaction of yours be used as an excuse against you." I nodded. Daniel was right. Ariana wanted me to break, to yell, to collapse in front of Evan so he would believe her entirely. I had to be careful with every step, every word, every breath. I left Daniel's office with my fingers gripping his notes on how to gather evidence, as if it were the only rope pulling me from a cliff. When I returned home, the kitchen smelled like freshly baked pastries. Ariana stood by the counter holding a stack of papers, looking calm in a way that chilled the air. Evan sat across from her, his hands clasped together as if awaiting a major decision. The room felt silent, like something was waiting to explode. Ariana turned, placed the stack of papers in front of me, and said, "Sign this, Mom, before it's too late." I looked down and realized I was standing at the edge of a turning point Ariana had planned for far longer than I knew. I have lived long enough to recognize the exact moment a woman decides to stand up and protect what belongs to her. And that afternoon, when Ariana placed the stack of papers in front of me, with that sweet, poisonous threat wrapped around each word, I knew I had reached my final limit. The kitchen was silent, the light cutting across our faces like a line between two battlegrounds. Evan sat there, his hands clasped, unaware that his family's inheritance was being laid out like portions in a cold negotiation. In that moment, the only thing still clear inside me was Victor's heartbeat, echoing in memory, telling me there are times one must stand their ground to protect their home. I lifted the stack of papers, and instead of reading a single line, I tore the first page. The sound of ripping paper cracked through the silence like a blade slicing the air. I tore the second page, the third, then the entire stack. Shredded pieces drifted to the floor like gray snow from a slow smoldering fire. Ariana froze for half a second, then her face twisted. "You rotten old woman!" The insult came out fast, sharp, stinging the air. I stood tall, my shoulders steady. After months of being pushed to the cliff's edge, I finally stepped out of the trap of silence Ariana had built around me. For the first time, I didn't retreat. I let those torn papers scatter at my feet like a declaration that I would not surrender anything Victor had left behind. Ariana lunged a step forward, her eyes glowing like burning coals. "I'll take Evan away from you." Her voice slid across the room like a cold gust from a grave. I looked straight at her, unflinching. "You can only take what's hollow." I saw Evan stiffen, wounded by half of that sentence, and startled by the other half, unsure whom the empty part was aimed at. Ariana opened her mouth as if to retaliate, but I turned away and opened the kitchen drawer. I took out the phone I had hidden for weeks, the one piece of truth I had saved for the moment. Reason needed proof. I placed it on the table and pushed it toward Ariana. "Here's evidence you staged the fake accident. The messages, the recordings, the timestamps. Explain this." Ariana stared at the phone as if it were a trivial object, a harmless insect. She didn't tremble, didn't deny. Instead, she laughed a sharp, bitter laugh like shattering glass. I did it. So what? Evan turned to her, his eyes blown wide. For the first time, my son saw a corner of the mask that had fallen from his wife's face. But Ariana didn't care about his shock. She folded her arms, stepping closer to me, her smile stretching with a glint of victory. A strange quiet settled inside my chest. No fear, no panic, just a cold clarity as I faced a person who no longer bothered to hide her true nature. I realized I had been right all along. A demon had been living in my home, walking on sharp heels and turning lies into weapons. Ariana tilted her head, her hair falling over her shoulder like darkness spilling across the kitchen. She took one deliberate step closer, her voice dropping heavy as acid. 1 month, and you're gone. I didn't respond, but inside a door opened, and for the first time in months, I knew I would not run. I would fight, because this is my home. And Ariana had just declared war. After Ariana hurled that cold steel threat that I had 1 month to disappear from my own home, the house fell into a suffocating silence where every movement carried an echo. Evan became a shaky bridge between two wolves, and I knew that if I kept confronting Ariana head-on, I would lose because my son had sunk too deep into the web she spun around him. But I also knew there are battles where stepping back is the way to step forward. I couldn't save Evan with tears or soft explanations. I had to save him with strategy. That evening, Evan stood in the living room, his hands gripping his hair, face red with the pressure of 100 voices tearing inside his mind. "Mom, stop making things hard for Ariana." His words snapped like a string pulled to its breaking point. I stood a few steps away, seeing the veins standing out on his neck, seeing the confusion and exhaustion of a man being used like a tool. A sharp tear ran across my chest. His words weren't a knife, they were a sledgehammer slamming into everything I had tried to preserve. "I've never tried to make things hard," I whispered. "I just want to protect what belongs to this family." But my reply didn't reach him. His eyes were clouded, a thin layer of doubt covering everything between us. He turned away, avoiding my gaze, as if it were too bright. I felt myself sink into a strange quiet where all emotional reactions were locked away. If I argued, I would lose Evan. If I escalated, Ariana would win. So I stepped into the one position no one expected. I pretended to lose. The next morning, I let Ariana see me linger at the kitchen table longer than usual, rubbing my forehead, sighing like a woman drained of all strength. When she glanced at me, I responded with a small nod, tired eyes, a voice soft enough for her to believe the lie. "I'll think about signing," I murmured, setting my teacup down as if marking my surrender. Ariana looked at me like a predator, eyeing prey that had finally stopped fighting. The alertness in her eyes dimmed, replaced by unfiltered triumph. She nearly hummed as she walked upstairs, her confident steps tapping along the wooden floor like a victory march. I watched her shadow disappear and knew this was the moment Ariana was most careless and the moment I was strongest. At noon, I met Daniel at the old cafe Victor used to love. A breeze from the window carried the scent of baked pastries and a lightness I hadn't felt in weeks. When I told him Ariana wanted to force a house transfer, Daniel opened his case and pulled out documents stamped with bright red seals. "You don't need to sign anything," he said. "The house is fully under your name. All legal rights belong to you. And if you want, we can begin the process to evict her immediately." I looked at the legal seals the way someone trapped for months might look at a crack of sunlight. "What about Evan?" I asked. Daniel leaned back, thinking, "Evan is being manipulated, but once Ariana loses her legal footing, the truth will surface. Your job is to stay safe and follow the process carefully." That afternoon, when I returned home, I stood before the old lock Victor had installed when Evan was in high school. I placed my hand on it, brushing across the metal like brushing a memory. All the arguments, insults, nights of Ariana's laughter echoing through my home surged back like scorched fragments. I bit my lip and called the locksmith. The drilling echoed through the house, each metallic bite carving away another layer of the chains I had carried on my back. The new lock shone bright, solid, cold, but with a safety I had missed for far too long. After the locksmith left, I stood at the door looking into the house like looking at a battleground shifting in my favor. I walked into the kitchen feeling light and heavy at the same time. Evan's half-empty glass still sat on the table, Ariana's fingerprints printed on the rim like a reminder that the war was still alive. But this time, I no longer trembled. I stood at the doorway, eyes fixed on the new lock. A thin smile formed on my lips, not of victory, but of readiness. "The final battle has come," I whispered, my hand resting on the new key. And I knew this time I held the advantage. That morning sunlight cut through the kitchen like a line drawn straight across a battlefield. I walked down the stairs with the certainty that everything had reached a point of no return. 3 months of torment, manipulation, and being turned into someone who was losing her mind had piled into a heavy block inside my chest. But beneath that block was a flame Ariana never expected me to still have. Evan sat at the table, dark circles under his eyes, while Ariana leaned against the counter wearing that smug look, convinced victory was hers. And at that moment, I decided to speak the sentence I had swallowed through countless shadowed nights. I looked straight at Ariana, my voice steady, unwavering. "1 month and you leave my house." No one reacted immediately. Evan lifted his head as if he'd been slapped, his chin trembling with shock. Ariana froze, the color draining from her face before her eyes narrowed into 2 sharp blades. I heard the soft clink of Evan's glass hitting the table because he dropped it without realizing. The silence stretched like a taut string pulled to breaking. Ariana slammed her hand on the table, the sound cracking through the kitchen. "I'll destroy you. You don't know what I can do." Her voice came out like metal, scraping over concrete, raw and feral, the true nature she'd concealed for 3 months. I stood tall, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair to keep my breath steady. "You've destroyed enough. Now it's my turn." The words came from the very place my fear used to live. I didn't yell, didn't shake, didn't plead. I spoke like someone who had finally finished negotiating with herself. Either I live again, or I let myself be erased from Victor's home. Evan looked between us like a man caught in a storm, but this wasn't the moment to reach for him. This was the last battle between me and the demon pretending to be my daughter-in-law. Ariana laughed, sharp, fractured, like glass breaking. "You think you've won? You have, Evan. You have anyone on your side? You think you can get rid of me? Pathetic." She stepped closer, each footfall hitting the floor like a threat, tearing the distance between us. But I didn't step back this time. My eyes stayed locked with hers, 2 blades meeting midair. Later that afternoon, Evan received notice he had to leave for a 2-day work trip. He stood at the door looking uneasy, his eyes flicking between me and Ariana, like someone afraid the storm would explode the moment he left. But he still closed the door and walked away, leaving the house to the 2 women who had already crossed every boundary with each other. Night fell slowly. I stood in the living room listening to Ariana's footsteps upstairs, each step pounding like a dark drumbeat. The air felt thick enough to choke on. The hallway light flickered once before stabilizing. Wind slipped through the front door crack, stirring the curtains as if someone had brushed past. I knew Ariana was calculating her next move, knew she wouldn't accept losing control, knew the battle would escalate exactly when she thought I might panic. Near midnight, I remained awake, waiting for any sound marking the second confrontation. Instead came an unsettling quiet. A quiet so heavy I could hear my heartbeat counting down inside my ribs. I walked down the hall, checking each doorway, each shadow, searching for signs of Ariana's presence. But the house felt too still. Then I realized something. Ariana wasn't in her room, not upstairs, not in the kitchen, not anywhere inside the house. She had vanished, silent as darkness pulling back from the corners. I stood in the living room, fists tightening instinctively, breath held steady. And then, as if the house sensed what was coming, the wind outside suddenly rose, rattling the front door. In that silence, I counted minutes. 1, 2, 5. Then, exactly at 3 a.m., the first sound echoed behind me. Ariana had returned. That night, the darkness inside the house thickened like a curtain being drawn down to prepare for the final act of the play Ariana had directed for 3 months. I sat on the sofa, both hands resting on my lap, watching the soft yellow light reflect on the new lock I had installed. Every breath I took was slow and deliberate, as if marking the last steps before battle. No Evan, no mediator, no one left for Ariana to hide behind. Only me and the demon named Ariana Brooks standing before the collapse she created. Near 3 a.m., the sharp screech of speeding brakes tore through the silence outside. I lifted my head. A staggering figure lurched toward the door. Then a pounding exploded across the wood, rattling the frame. "Ariana," I whispered, as if greeting the shadow I had been waiting for all night. Then came the first scream that ripped the night apart. "Open the door! This is my house!" Her voice was hoarse from alcohol, yet still full of the ferocity of someone who believed she could not lose. Ariana pounded hard enough to shake the knob with every blow, as if trying to rip it off entirely. I stood and walked toward the door, stopping 1 step away. I could feel her breath thick with liquor and hatred seeping through the gap. "Marjorie," I said, "open it. You think you won." Her fist slammed again and again. "Open the door now!" A cold clarity settled through me. I placed one hand on the wall, stood tall, and responded with a voice neither raised nor trembling, but icy enough to still the air. "No, you will never enter my life again." Silence lasted barely 2 seconds before Ariana shrieked, her scream filled with despair and rage. She kicked the door, beat it with her fists, stomped violently on the porch like an animal losing control. Neighbors flicked on porch lights, stepped outside, raised their phones to record. "Ariana, stop it! Get a grip!" But she didn't hear anything. She kept hammering the door, howling, collapsing into a frenzy. Through the peephole, I saw her eyes red like burning coals. Mascara smeared into black streaks, hair tangled, shirt slipping off one shoulder, her whole body swaying with drunken incoherence. The confident, cruel Ariana was gone, replaced by a warped reflection of who she once pretended to be. After 5 minutes, police sirens wailed closer. A patrol car pulled up outside, 2 officers stepping out. They tried speaking to Ariana, but she screamed over them. "I live here! That crazy old woman won't let me in. I'll sue." "Have you been drinking?" one officer asked, flashlight shining on her face. Ariana stumbled, the stench of alcohol rolling off her clothes. I didn't. No. She didn't finish before she tripped on the porch step, nearly collapsing, caught only by the officer's arm. Phone camera zoomed in. The entire neighborhood stood frozen watching. The second officer cuffed her wrists. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and driving under the influence. Ariana screamed again, weaker this time, like a broken string. She was guided into the car under the harsh spotlight of neighbors' cameras and a night eager to swallow her whole. By the next morning, the video of Ariana drunk, screaming, and being handcuffed had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. That evening, a coworker of hers texted me, "Ariana's suspended. The board is voting to terminate her." Another message, "Her friends cut her off. Everyone's scared after seeing the clip." But what stilled me longest was the message from Evan. He flew home at 10. He watched the entire recording, sent by neighbors, jaw tight, eyes hollow. Then he looked at me, voice breaking. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't see the truth." I didn't answer. I placed my hand on his shoulder, letting him know I forgave him. Ariana was fined, fired, abandoned by her friends. She lost her husband, lost her home, lost her reputation, lost everything she once used to threaten me. But that night, as I prepared for bed, my phone chimed. A new email. I opened it. "I lost, but you'll remember me for the rest of your life." No threat, no scheme, no rage, just the final echo of a self-destroying shadow. I turned off my phone and closed the door Ariana had forced open for 3 long months. And in the moment that door closed, I understood that sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or arguments, but from the instant we choose to stand firm, reclaim our lives, and let the darkness destroy itself.